All right, so it's 11:03, so I think it's a good time to get started. So thanks for coming, everybody. So today we're going to hear from, this is the third talk in our winter Tech Talk series uh, about AI. So we have two more coming up after this. So this is going to be recorded just so everybody knows. And yeah, we've got Weng-Keen Wong with us today. He's a professor in the School of ECS, and he's been here at OSU 1 year less than me. So he really, when I came, and then soon after we hired a whole bunch of AI folks. Weng-Keen was right at the front end of that wave, and he came from he did a Ph.D. at Carnegie Mellon and studied sort of anomaly detection there as well, disease outbreak detection. So he's really been in this area of looking for weird, interesting things for a while, and he's worked on many different applied projects. He took a stint at NSF as a program manager. That was quite a service to do. And he also is a co-director of the Pervasive Personalized Intelligence Center that we have here, that is intended to try to get collaborations between industry and the university. So if that's something that any of you are interested in, he's definitely the person to talk about that with. So without further ado, I'll let Weng-Keen take over. If you have questions, you can type them in chat during. I'll monitor, and at the end we'll also have time for some questions. All right, so go ahead, Weng-Keen.
Okay, thanks very much, Alan, and thanks for just the opportunity to give this talk. So this talk is entitled Looking for Weird Things in Data. It's a very quick whirlwind tour of anomaly detection. I'll talk a little bit about what it is, and then I'll just go through some snippets of research that we've done over the years or are doing right now that are related to this theme. Okay, so many of our audience members are familiar with AI and machine learning. And in machine learning, it's often presented as a way of learning patterns or discovering patterns in the data that you can then exploit to do things like prediction or classification or regression. And there's kind of a converse problem of that, which is, what about the data instances that don't fit the dominant patterns? So in this very simple example here, I've got this simple linear decision boundary separating blue dots from red dots. And textbook machine learning says focus on finding these decision boundaries. But if you're kind of a curious person, you look at these two red dots in the corner here and you think to yourself, that's kind of weird. What's going on there? And discovering these weird sort of data instances is a field of machine learning known as anomaly detection. This is actually a very big umbrella, and it covers many different areas. And it's also somewhat ill-defined, but generally think of it as finding weird things in data. I'm going to walk you through a couple of example applications of this. Some of the early work in anomaly detection actually came in statistical quality control. And here you had some kind of manufacturing process. Let's say you're manufacturing these gears and you wanted to observe or look for defects in this process. So let's say you're monitoring the width of these gears. You have some kind of tolerance limits on how big or how small the gears can be when they're manufactured. And if they are either too small or too big, you raise a flag and say, this is a defect, and you take it off your assembly line and put it into the defect pile. So historically, this was done on a univariate data set, but nowadays, present day manufacturing processes are much more complex. You are often facing highly multivariate data, and sometimes you're even looking at time series data because you have sensors everywhere. Now, speaking of sensors, there's also a big industry for introducing telemetry. And so you have sensors on pretty much everything these days that collect data. So you have sensors in your car, you have sensors in various health monitoring devices, you have sensors in your pipes sometimes, you have sensors on your crops. And these allow you to do two different things. One is it allows you to monitor for some kind of event of interest. For example, it might be an adverse event like you have a water leak in your basement, or an adverse event like you have frost that's going to kill all of the grapes in your vineyard. Another thing that it allows you to do is it allows you to be proactive in terms of predictive maintenance. So you might be able to proactively replace your light bulbs before they blow, or proactively refill the ink in your printer. Another great example of anomaly detection is in data cleaning. And I have here a figure from Ethan Derazinski's PhD thesis here at Oregon State University. Here, it's an illustration of an environmental sensor network that was deployed at the H.J. Andrews Experimental Forest. And if you've ever worked with environmental sensors before, you'll realize that all kinds of random stuff happens that causes errors in the data. To take, for example, number 3 here, which is anomaly number 3 here, this was caused by a wind speed sensor that froze solid when the temperature dropped. So the wind speed sensor no longer had any readings. So you've got a little bit of a flat line here. And then when it unfroze, it continued happily observing wind speed as normal. There are other weird issues, like here it's I think it was a calibration problem or some kind of data logger problem that caused these big spikes in there, but then it was fixed and everything sort of went happily along its way. Now, data cleaning is important because you want to remove some of these weird errors so that you can then apply a machine learning algorithm to identify the dominant patterns in the data. And so this is, of course, ongoing work. It's not a solved problem by any means. Nowadays, of course, one of the biggest examples of anomaly detection is in biosurveillance. Now, I actually worked on biosurveillance as a grad student looking for disease outbreaks. And back then, we were concerned about things like bioterrorist attacks and SARS. But now, of course, it's all come to the forefront with COVID-19. And here's a typical graph that you would see that shows the number of reported COVID-19 cases in Oregon. And you want to be able to detect when a new surge is happening. However, you may be also interested in characterizing this outbreak with a little bit more detail. For instance, identifying the zip codes that are hotspots, or identifying demographic groups that are primarily getting infected with COVID-19. And finally, the really neat things that we do with anomaly detection also relate to science, and it can be a big help in terms of scientific discovery. Here I've got pictures from a really old data set, the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, where you could try and find anomalous galaxies. And this is something that my advisor and my colleagues in my PhD lab were working on. And typically the anomalies can correspond to one of two things. It could be things that don't match scientific theories, and it could lead to new scientific hypotheses and discoveries. Or sometimes they could actually just be really boring. So we found that you can discover things like bugs in a telescope or things like that, which really won't lead to a Nobel Prize, but might be interesting for the people running the telescopes. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to just be introducing the problem a little bit more with a little bit more detail. I'm going to try and avoid the use of the word normal data points, even though you all know what I mean by that. And the reason for that is because it gets kind of confusing when you have normal or Gaussian distributions in the talk. And so you don't quite know whether you're referring to normal as in the statistical term or normal as in the English term. So I'm going to call these nominal data instances. These are data instances generated by the usual process. And we're going to call an anomaly something that is a data instance generated by a process that is different from the nominal generating process. And your goal here is you want to try and identify meaningful or interesting anomalies. And we'll be a little bit more precise about that in just a little bit. So the big question that you'll probably ask if you've taken machine learning before is, why can't you just use supervised learning? And the answer is you might be able to. If you have enough labeled anomalies that you care about, you can set it up as a supervised learning problem. The issue with this is that for most domains that we work in, the anomalies are extremely rare and you don't have enough labeled anomalies. And in some cases, it's less than 1% of the data. If you try and set this up to do supervised learning, you'll find that it fails miserably because of this huge class imbalance. So your training algorithms won't converge, or they'll converge to some kind of degenerate solution. and you're just in trouble. So you do actually need a new way of looking at this, and this is the field of anomaly detection. So in standard anomaly detection, or what I consider to be standard anomaly detection, you are looking for point anomalies. These are isolated data points that are weird, according to some model. The anomaly detection algorithm operates in an unsupervised fashion, so you don't have labels, you're just given the data. And your goal is to assume that this data represents the nominal distribution. So you're going to model this nominal distribution, even though in reality, there may be some contamination from anomalies in your data, but if they're rare, this is typically something that you can live with. You will then score your data instances by how much they deviate from this nominal model. And typically, you would return back a ranked list ranked according to the score. And these are candidate or putative anomalies that your human analyst or some other downstream process will look at and inspect with a little bit more care. Okay, at this point, I'm just going to do a really quick whirlwind tour of methods used for anomaly detection. And these are things that you would typically pull off the shelf. And they're existing methods that are well known in the literature. This is not meant to be exhaustive by any means. If you're interested in more information, I can point you to several surveys at the end of this talk. For instance, there's this well-known survey by Chandola et al. 2009 that is a decent survey of the field of anomaly detection, although it is about 12 years out of date by now. Okay, so one of the easiest things you can do if you're trying to look for anomalies is to run a clustering algorithm. You're going to cluster your data into groups, and the anomalies are assumed to be data points that are far away from the nearest cluster centroid. They may be isolated data points, or they might be singleton clusters, as I've shown, small clusters, as I've shown here, but they're just far away from these cluster centers. And I've shown here the results of running something like k-means, and k-means produces these nice Voronoi diagrams, and the clusters are shown right here. Another really simple thing that you can do is you can take a more statistical route. You can do a density-based approach where you perform some kind of density estimation. For instance, you could use a parametric model like a Gaussian mixture model. And in the Gaussian mixture model, you have these football shapes that correspond to the Gaussians. And these football shapes define the cluster centers, and anything that is not part of these dense regions, you can consider to be an anomaly. You can rank them according to their probability, according to this density estimator. Parametric models suffer from the issue that they have very strong assumptions about the shape of your data. So if you would like to take a non-parametric approach, you could do something like do a nearest neighbor type density estimation, or if you want to be more sophisticated, you could do kernel density estimation and then report things that are low probability with respect to those density estimators. Okay, there's another class of methods that are based on support vector machines. And I find it easiest to maybe use the support vector data description algorithm as a sort of canonical example of this. And here that algorithm tries to find a minimum volume hypersphere shown with this dotted line here that encloses 1 minus delta proportion of the data or percentage of the data. This delta parameter corresponds to some kind of prior belief about the fraction of the data that is anomalous. And so you can set up an optimization problem that produces this nice hypersphere, and anything that doesn't fit within this hypersphere is considered to be an anomaly. And you can rank them by distance from this dotted line and so on. There's a similar approach called the one-class SVM, which is a slight variant of this that more or less does the same thing. And these are just methods that you can use related to support vector machines. In practice, I found that these methods are very sensitive to delta, and sometimes you don't have a good idea what delta is, and so these methods don't work as well when that hyperparameter is not correctly set. Another big class of methods are local density methods, and what they do is they look at the local density around the point, and if it turns out that a local density for a point is smaller than its neighbors, then it's declared to be an anomaly. Now, to give you an understanding of what local density is, think of local density as the distance to, let's say, the 2 nearest neighbors. So if you take this red dot right here, its distance to its two nearest neighbors is shown by these two red arrows here. And if you consider, let's say, this blue dot right here, it has a much closer distance to its second nearest neighbor. And so you can see that the further away the second nearest neighbor is, the lower the local density is going to be. And finally, I'm going to introduce isolation forest. This is a really nice algorithm. It's typically the algorithm that I would pull off the shelf and apply to a problem if I knew nothing about the problem and I'm just wanting to apply something really quickly. Isolation forest works according to this intuition that if you have anomalies, they're much easier to separate out from the nominals. And so what this algorithm does is it builds an isolation tree. An isolation tree is essentially a random binary search tree that splits on a randomly chosen dimension and then splits on a randomly chosen value of that dimension. And the goal is to try and isolate each data point out to a leaf of that tree. And the intuition, again, is that the path length from the root to the leaf is going to be shortest for anomalies than they are, shorter for anomalies than they are for nominals. Of course, because this is a randomly split tree, what you want to do is you want to repeat this process many times. So you end up building an ensemble of isolation trees, and then you want to report the average isolation path length as your anomaly score. This works really well, provided your data is using continuous values. And we have a couple of papers that have tried evaluating this in terms of benchmark data sets. We find that it works fairly well on average. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to stop talking about sort of a survey of work that's out there and start focusing in on some of the projects related to anomaly detection that my lab has worked on, as well as other of my colleagues here at OSU. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is spatial anomaly detection, and this is joint work with my former PhD student, Travis Moore, who is now a postdoc at OHSU. So spatial anomaly detection shows up in many places. Of course, COVID-19, we talked about looking for hotspots for a new surge, and you can see from this heat map right here of what zip codes, or sorry, which counties are hotspots for emerging surges. We're also looking for hotspots in terms of species distribution models. And so this is an example from eBird, where birders report sightings of bird species. And there's a hotspot right here in Philomath. If you're familiar with what that hotspot is, that's actually the Philomath sewage plant. There's a lot of birds that like to go there and eat insects and things like that. And you can also run spatial anomaly detection in terms of some kind of economic metrics, things like unemployment. And here, this is a result from one of our papers that shows a high unemployment counties, that should say, from 2016. All of these spatial anomaly detection problems have this need to find a spatially contiguous region that has some kind of anomalous signal in it. And that spatial contiguity is what makes this problem different and somewhat difficult, and thus requires a new type of approach. Okay, so if you were to look at the spatial anomaly detection problem, one of the very standard algorithms that you'll pull off the shelf is called the spatial scan statistic. And the spatial scan statistic operates on spatial point processes, which I will now describe. So in a spatial point process, you essentially have some space, and you have a bunch of data instances that are these blue dots. And the only identifying characteristic about these instances is their coordinates. So in 2D, the only thing that defines them is their 2D coordinates. If you draw a bounding box around them, let's call it B here, you're interested in the number of blue points that falls in that bounding box. And this number is going to be dependent on the area of the bounding box B. And so you could say that this is drawn from some distribution, like a Poisson distribution, or a binomial distribution, but there are well-known statistical models for modeling the number of points here. And when you're doing spatial anomaly detection, you're typically interested in two types of anomalies. So let's say you have nominal behavior here, which is artificially sort of drawn as this uniformly sampled grid. You might be interested in an overdensity, which is shown here, or you may be interested in an underdensity, which is shown here, where you've got a sparse number of points in a particular region. So you would like an algorithm that operates on these spatial point processes to discover either overdensities or underdensities. Okay, so fortunately there is an algorithm, a very well-known class of algorithms that does that, and it's called the spatial scan statistic, developed by Kuldorf in '97. So the goal here is to find unusual spatial regions. For simplicity, think of it as finding unusual overdensities. So there's two steps. One is you need to do some kind of search for the most unusual region. And then the second step here is once you've found the most unusual region, you want to output its score, which is in the form of some kind of adjusted p-value. Okay, and I'm going to go into more details into these two steps. So in terms of searching for the most unusual region, the first thing you have to do is you have to pick a shape. And in this case, I'm using circles. Circles are really convenient because they're easily defined. You just need a center and a radius. And they're also very easy to check for membership to see if a point falls into the circle or hypersphere or not. So we're going to pick circles as our search shape. And the goal here is you want to search for all possible circles. And these circles correspond to contiguous subsets of the data. So if you center your circle on, let's say, this black data point right here, the circle, the inner red circle is going to encompass that one data point. And you want to grow the circle so that it will start to encompass other data points as it grows. And you can see here that there are actually a finite number of possible circles for this data set. There just happens to be a lot of them. So you're going to search through all of these circles. And for each circle, you're going to score that circle. The scoring is going to be in terms of the unusualness of the data inside the circle. And the way to think about this is this circle is going to encompass a bunch of data points in here. There's also going to be a bunch of data points outside the circle. And you're going to do a very simple test that says, is the probability of the data inside the circle equal to the probability outside? Or in the case of overdensities, is the probability of the data inside the circle bigger than the probability of the data outside the circle? This can be very easily done using a likelihood ratio test. And you're literally going to be scoring this ratio here, the probability of the data inside the circle, which is the alternate hypothesis, divided by the probability of data with respect to this null hypothesis that the probabilities are going to be equal to each other. And you're going to return the region C that has the maximum score from this likelihood ratio test. Okay, and there's a bunch of likelihood ratio tests that are in the literature that are very standard that you can pull off and use right here. So this sounds great. You can search, assuming you can do the search efficiently, you can search for the circle that has the biggest score. The problem is that this p-value that you get back can't be used at face value. If you're familiar with the multiple hypothesis testing problem in statistics, this is a textbook case of that. Essentially what the multiple hypothesis testing problem does is it says that as you run more and more of these hypothesis tests, the probability that you're going to encounter a false positive, a type 1 error, is going to be converging to 1. And so you need to adjust the p-values that come out of your likelihood ratio test. There's some very easy ways in which you can adjust this p-value. You can do what's called a Bonferroni correction, which is a very conservative way of adjusting them. Or you could do a more sophisticated thing, which is what the spatial scan statistic does, of using a randomization test. Randomization tests are great because they allow you to actually correctly adjust a p-value with respect to your null distribution, but it is time consuming. So the way it works is you need to replicate your data set many, many times, let's say 1,000 or 10,000 times under the null distribution. And this allows you to form a histogram, and then you can see how rare your original p-value was with respect to this histogram of p-values. And then you report its adjusted p-value in terms of this replicate histogram. This works really well in practice. The problem is, of course, it's time consuming. So I've just described the original sort of standard form of the spatial scan statistic. And there's a couple of pretty glaring errors in it. Number one, you need to commit to a shape, such as a circle. If your data does not fit a circle, so in some cases, you might be interested in looking at river networks or pipe networks within a city. These have a very long filament-like shape. They don't fit a circle very well, so a circle is not a great choice for that, and you have to develop sort of a new sort of search algorithm for that. The search is computationally expensive. You typically approximate it by saying that you will only allow circles up to a maximum radius, or you can search over some approximate search technique. And then the other problem is the randomization test to correct the p-values. The randomization test is actually the bottleneck because you end up repeating this procedure many, many times, usually like 1,000 or 10,000 times, and it's extremely slow. So there's been extensive research over the years on how you can improve the spatial scan statistic. My former academic sibling, Daniel Neal, and his students who are now faculty at Harvard and IBM have developed much more efficient versions of the spatial scan statistic. So research is ongoing, and people are coming up with new ways of improving it and new applications of it over time. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a little twist on the spatial scan statistic. This is now going to be a twist on it that looks at a slightly different version of the point process data. So now consider a new type of data, and if you want to think about it in terms of a concrete problem, think about it in terms of real estate sales. Okay, so you've got, and this is actually a map I got from Realtor.com of Corvallis that shows properties for sale around Corvallis. So every property here has associated with it a spatial location as well as a house price, which is the response variable, and it's a continuous value. And each location also has associated with it a set of features describing the house, things like square footage, number of bathrooms, number of bedrooms. And the goal here is to work with this kind of data and try and look for anomalies in this kind of data. So, are there any anomalous house prices in here that should be of interest? This type of problem is actually very common, and I'm actually encountering a lot of it in different areas. So to give you an example, we've already talked about real estate. We can also do things like property tax assessment. Is there any property that has, or is there a group of properties that are anomalous in terms of property taxes in a particular region of the city? We actually ran this analysis on Portland and found some interesting things there. Since we have an ag institute, we can also look at anomalous crop yields. Are there areas that have either unusually high or unusually low crop yields? I've done work on, of course, looking for species abundance and unusual areas with respect to certain species abundances. And then you can also do an environmental monitoring. Are there areas of a city that are unusually polluted or unusually not polluted? So the list of domains is growing. If you have a problem that looks like this, I would love to talk to you because I'm always looking for new problems to work on that are related to this particular thing. Okay, so let's talk about how you actually solve this problem. The first thing is you can assume that there's a very simple linear model that describes the response. And the simplest thing is to assume something like a linear regression where your response Y is a linear combination of the features and your goal is to estimate these beta coefficients. You can use this linear model inside a spatial scan statistic framework. And it turns out that you don't really have to work too hard. You just have to come up with a different likelihood ratio test. And there's actually likelihood ratio tests in the literature that compare linear regressions. And so the test that you're going to do is you're going to fit a model to the data inside, let's say, the circle. You're going to fit another linear regression model to the data outside the circle, and you're going to compare their two models. If the models that are inside and outside are significantly different, then you're going to say that you've got an anomaly there. Otherwise, you're going to say, it's not an anomaly. So the twist, though, that we're going to do is we are going to look at quantiles. And what do you mean by this? Well, a quantile is a part of the distribution that is a particular part of the distribution that you're interested in. So suppose that you are a high-end realtor and you want to look for expensive houses in Corvallis. And you wanted to focus in on houses at the 90th percentile or 0.9 quantile in terms of prices. And so to do this, you would want to develop a quantile spatial scan statistic. This says that you want to focus in on the 10th quantile, and this is basically the topic of our paper from 2018. I'm going to go into this in a little bit more detail. So if you wanted to do spatial scan statistics with a quantile regression, that's actually not too bad of an idea. Quantile regression is a very special case of a linear regression. A linear regression typically fits the conditional mean. And what a quantile regression does is it fits to a particular quantile of the data And so to give you an example here, the 0.5 quantile is the median of the data. If you wanted to focus on high-end houses and look at the 90th quantile or 90th percentile, you would be looking at fitting this red line over here. And if you wanted to look at low-end houses, you could fit to the 0.1 quantile here if, let's say, you were looking at cheap houses. So where quantile regression is particularly useful is when you have a lot of the variance on your data actually differs depending on which quantile you're looking at. And here, what happens is certain coefficients have different values depending on what quantile you're looking at. To make this more concrete, suppose you were looking at house prices, and let's say that you're looking at high-end houses, and suppose the value of the size of your garage matters a lot to somebody who's paying for a multi-million-dollar house because they really care if they can fit 20 cars in their garage versus 2. Whereas for most of us that only have, the 2-car garage, the number of cars you can fit in your garage is pretty minimal and has lower weight. So whenever you have values of your coefficients differing depending on the quantile regression is extremely useful. So then the other thing that quantile regression is used for is that mean-based tests are very susceptible to noise and outliers. The mean is known to be very non-robust, and the moment you have a very big or very low value, it throws off your means. Anyone here who's ever had to calculate the mean for the assignments in a course realizes that the people that don't submit assignments throw off the mean very quickly. Right? So what people in statistics do is they say, well, you should be using the median instead. And the median is, again, a very special case of a quantile. And quantile regression gives you a little bit more robustness to irrelevant data points. So then the other thing that you have to do is you have to come up with a new likelihood ratio test to compare quantile regressions. And we recommend using the rank test. The rank test is faster than the likelihood ratio test and also the wall test. And it works in the same way as what we've originally been presenting. You fit a quantile regression to the entire model at some tauth quantile, and then you compare that regression model to a quantile regression model fit to everything within the subset. And you ask the question, are they the same or are they different within and outside of that circle? Okay, if you do this, there's pros and cons to it. So the pros we've already been through. It allows you to fit to a specific quantile of interest. It's robust to outliers and noise. The cons are this rank test is really, really slow. It actually requires you to do something that is at least n cubed in the inner loop. And so you don't want to do that. And you would love to find some way to make it faster. And so it's currently intractable in its current form. And what my student Travis and I worked on was trying to come up with a much faster way of doing this analysis. And the way that we came up with was based on this very fast incremental optimization. So one of the things that happens with the spatial scan statistic is you're constantly growing your spatial region. So you start with 1 data point, you grow it to 2, and so on and so on. So as this circle grows, you're going to sort of swallow up this blue data point as it grows. If you do this quantile scan statistic naively, you're going to recompute the quantile regression from scratch every time. This is a really bad idea. It's very slow. And what you want to do is you want to make it an incremental update so that when you add that 1 point, it quickly updates the coefficients in your quantile regression. And the idea here is to reuse information from the previous iteration to help you get going on the new data point when you incorporate it. This sounds like a great idea, except that quantile regression is very holistic in the sense that when you add a new data point, it can actually fundamentally change the way this quantile regression line is fit. And it's hard to sort of update this very quickly, and it requires a new trick. Now, unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about this trick because it's very involved and it involves a lot of linear algebra tricks, but I can give you sort of the gist of it. So what you do, and this is actually an idea that Travis developed, which is very clever, you develop a new matrix basis for your model. So you take your current quantile regression model, and inside a circle or outside a circle, you use a new matrix basis for it. And under this new matrix basis, you can then update your rank test really, really quickly. This is what we call a rank 1 update. The results are pretty cool. It allows you to update it very quickly when you add a new point. And to give you an idea of how quick of an update this is, if you recompute everything from scratch, you've got this worse than quadratic kind of line. And if you do this incremental rank test, it's almost this flat linear line here in terms of number of data points added. So it's a very, very quick update, and it moves very, very quickly. It allows you to do some pretty cool analysis on data that was not previously possible. So to give you an idea of this, this is a quick plot of education and unemployment. So we're trying to predict unemployment rates in terms of education status. And if you do a mean-based spatial scan, you get this result here, which is trying to identify counties that had the highest unemployment in 2016. If you run it with our quantile scan statistic, you can do it at different percentiles or quantiles. So this is, again, looking at areas with very high unemployment. You can do the reverse of that and look at areas with very low unemployment that are very unusual with respect to the country. And here it's picking out a lot of the oil-based industries in areas like the Dakotas and south of Dakotas in the US. Okay, so then I'm going to run out of time here, but I want to spend the last 10 minutes talking about my current project. So I'm just very quickly going to mention the QSNAP algorithm. The QSNAP algorithm is an extension of the current algorithm that looks at quantiles, but now what we're going to do is we're going to look at 2 snapshots in time. And here we're looking at bird distribution data. So we're going to look at bird distribution data in January and bird distribution data in April. And we're going to look for differences between these 2 time snapshots in terms of these quantiles. This is a whole new optimization problem that requires a new sort of basis trick that we had to develop. And I'll refer you to our paper from 2020 that actually does this work if you're interested in the details. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead now and talk about my latest work. So this is yet another anomaly detection problem that is a variation of it. And this is work on Changepoint covariance changepoint detection. This is joint work with my PhD student Taylor, and I'm also an undergrad, Sabrina, who's at U of O. I've got collaborators in stats here at OSU with Sharmadeep Bhattacharya and also Shashendu Chatterjee from CUNY. And I've also got industry collaborators with Rahul Khanna and Giuseppe Raffa from Intel. Okay, so the idea behind covariance changepoint detection is as follows. Number one, I'm going to talk about changepoint detection. Changepoint detection is a field in statistics where you are looking for a point in time when the distribution for your data changes. Most of the literature deals with this in terms of changes to the mean, and we are interested in the other version of this problem, which is changes to the covariance. And there's much less work involved in this. So to give you an example, suppose you've got 2 sensors here. One is orange, one is blue. They're perfectly correlated before this red bar, and after this red bar, they become totally uncorrelated. And I wish I had time to actually grab some stock prices, but you can actually see this effect very dramatically on certain types of stocks pre and post pandemic. And so it's pretty interesting there. So there's not a lot of work in this area. And if you were to do sort of the naive thing here, what you would do is you would x1 through xk here is data before your change point, xk plus 1 to xt is data after your change point. You would fit some kind of distribution to the data before this change point. Let's say it's got parameters mu for the mean and sigma for the variance or covariance. And you would just compare their variances and see if sigma is different from sigma prime. Okay, and abstractly, this is what it would look like. You have your data, you do covariance estimation, you run some kind of change point detection algorithm, and then you score that particular time t. And you can do this with existing algorithms in the literature. The problem is when you get to high dimensional data. When you have very high dimensional data, this covariance estimation degrades really, really dramatically. In fact, many papers have shown that the eigenvalues get very badly skewed, both at the high end and at the low end of the eigenvalues. So your eigenvectors get very skewed, and you get a very bad sense of what's going on in the data. The other big issue is all of the algorithms that we can think of, except for maybe 1 or 2, don't localize the change in terms of the dimensions. So they simply tell you, yep, you've got a change in distribution at time t, but you really want to know more about the change. Like, what actually does this change involve? What variables does it involve? And that would really help me figure out what's going on, especially in a high dimensional world with hundreds or thousands of dimensions. So this is ongoing work. Someday I may give a talk on this once we've finished the research, but it's something that I wanted to mention. Okay, so I'm running out of time here. I want to leave enough time for questions, so I'm going to just very briefly talk about anomaly detection with feedback. This is joint work with my student Shubhamoy Das and my colleagues Alan Fern and Tom Dietrich. Anomaly detection does not typically work in a vacuum. You typically have an anomaly detector that presents results to an analyst who then gives feedback on that results. And typically that feedback is in the sense of, they'll label data, they'll throw it back into your data set, and then your anomaly detector will go to work again. You really want some kind of feedback loop here because in many cases, your anomaly detector's idea of an interesting or meaningful anomaly is not perfectly in line with what a human would consider to be interesting. So statistically unusual is not necessarily interesting. And you want this analyst feedback to help guide your anomaly detector towards interesting. So we have a paper from, the journal versions from 2020, where the anomaly detector is given some budget B of queries. The reason that you have a budget here is because a human analyst can only look at so many queries before they get sick of it. When I was working on biosurveillance, we estimated that it took about half an hour to 1 hour for somebody in public health to fully investigate a case that we presented to them. So half an hour to an hour adds up really quickly when you have things to investigate. So we have a budget. The anomaly detector asks the human, label this data instance as either anomaly or nominal. If the analyst calls it to be a nominal instance, we kind of want it to not pay attention to things that are similar to that. And if the analyst labels it as an anomaly, then it's something that we really are interested in. And the goal here is to have the anomaly detector present as many true anomalies to the analyst as possible. And of course, we want the algorithm to also incorporate this feedback back into it. So, just a few more details about this. This was formulated as a ranking problem. We had the feedback incorporated into the ranking algorithm such that anomalies placed in the top tau quantile, while nominals, are ranked below. And our results show that this feedback is actually very valuable. It skews things in the right direction so that the algorithm focuses on more promising regions rather than the unpromising regions. Okay, I'm running out of time here, so let me just end. And I just want to say that anomaly detection is a really active area of machine learning. It's got a lot of real-world applications. There's many variants of it that researchers such as myself are working on. We love weird data, but we also love humans that can help us interpret the weird data because it then leads to better algorithms. If you have any data that you think would be great for anomaly detection, I'd love to talk to you. My email is right here, and I'm happy to field questions right now while I'm on the call.
All right, thanks. We love weird data. That's a new slogan, I guess.
Yeah.
I love some weird data. Others not so much, but I don't know about my students. Yeah, so thanks a lot. I've got questions, but I'm checking. But anybody else with questions can speak up or type in the chat. Okay, so
there's a question.
Yeah.
So there's a question here saying, are any of the anomaly detection types better at ignoring dirty data? And that's kind of a loaded question because there are a lot of things that you can do to dirty data to ignore it. The bigger question is, how is the data dirty? In the sense that, there's a whole field of robust statistics that is great at developing methods to ignore really extreme outliers. And so that's certainly applicable. But there's times when you have other weird things in your data, like the sensor network problem that I had described, where you have flat lines, which are fairly easy to detect and flag. But then there's also more sophisticated type of anomalies that are not so easily discovered. So there isn't really a one-size-fits-all solution here. It really depends on what you mean by dirty data.
Yeah, and I guess I have maybe it's just question or comment to hear your thoughts on. But you know, as you know, we've worked in this area. You know, I've almost decided that super high dimensional anomaly detection, which you could think of as like the most interesting research field, is almost impossible, and like you'll never get the false alarm rate down if you're really looking for high dimensional anomalies. And you know, I was interested in your perspective on sort of working, you know, keeping, you know, pushing in that direction versus, you know, will it really be all about interfaces and getting people to define the right types of anomaly detection problems that our detectors can actually solve, and how would we characterize what those problems are like? So that's not exactly a question, but I'm just curious about your perspective on that.
Sure. Yeah, I think I agree with you about the high dimensional anomaly hunting problem. Like, it's very ill-defined and almost everything is an anomaly in high dimensions. So you need help in some form. You need guidance for the anomaly detector, either in the form of maybe human feedback or domain knowledge or something else, right, that can help guide this anomaly detector to identify the anomalies, because there's a lot of directions or dimensions in high dimensions that are just irrelevant too. So you need to be able to cut through all that.
Yeah, and I've always been fascinated by, maybe you've seen this as well, but your high dimensional anomaly detector works, but it's because one dimension was really crazy, and we could have just been looking for flat lines or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot of interesting work on ignoring pointless anomalies that are not interesting. And you know, there's, of course, we've done some work on that, and Curie Wagstaff has done some work on that as well.
Yeah, so there's a well, question about whether the slides will be available. So the video will be available on our Tech Talk website. I'll put that link in the chat, but probably if you email Weng-Keen, he might be willing to share the slides.
Yeah, I'm more than happy to share the slides if you just email me.
Yeah. Yeah. So do we have any other questions about weird data or? All right, going once, going twice. Well, thanks a lot, everybody. So I guess we'll end today's Tech Talk. And as I said, the talk will be going on the website. I will get that in chat before I sign off. So if you want to see what that is, but you can get there from the EECS website. We'll be back in 2 weeks with our next session. So yeah, watch your emails. You'll be getting some announcements for that. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.